how do we do this consistently and effectively? How do we make sure we're getting real, meaningful feedback? And then when we have these divergent opinions and thoughts and views, are we reporting how we handle that? Like, especially to our researchers? Like, are we sharing with other researchers how we handle that? Are we sharing our social validity results? As we've shown, you can publish without social validity. So when the social validity aren't good, are we addressing that?
We're all navigating these kind of like power dynamics, but no one's really talking about it. Especially you're not seeing it in the literature of maybe dissenting opinions of social validity and how you came to a conclusion that you would implement something a different way. So that's something we're really interested in as a future direction, is like, how do we navigate these complex issues?
Hello, welcome to Cooperant Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Steary. We're back for another episode, an exciting one today, but we're in the throes of summer right now, mid-July. It is just
I have
sweltering
97 here today.
Yeah, it's ridiculous outside. I'm the kids were playing in the sprinkler the other day, and I was like, just douse me. I don't even care.
The bad thing is, and just for anybody watching this, if you see me grimacing, my back is completely destroyed at this point. But because I have to sit with an ice pack on myself all day long, it's actually not too bad.
Perfect. I'm actually in a very cold basement, so I do have I'm good right now, but
did they at least slip you lunch under the door?
Yes.
Or anything like that?
Yeah, they feed me here. You made fun of my thumb injury a few weeks ago. I feel like this is ripe for payback, but I'm going to be my Indiana self here and not cause problems.
The worst part is it just started hurting while standing and cooking steaks. So I don't even have a fun story. Yeah.
Oh no, I'm so sorry, Steve. Yeah, I won't make fun of you.
You probably should, but that's okay.
Well, hey, a quick reminder before we kick things off: Cooperant is a project of Sparks Behavioral Services LLC, an ACE-approved CE provider. If you're listening to this right now and you're thinking, "Hey, how can it get any better?" I'm listening to Kyle make fun of Steve a little bit, but not really. Steve's talking about steaks. We're listening to some really, really cool behavior analytic discussion. Like, hey, it can get better. We actually have CEs available on our website for many of our episodes. So enjoy this episode. And if you want to dive deeper into it by acquiring some CEUs, check out cooperantlearning.com. There's all sorts of episodes on there and topics. That said, today we have another episode, and we have some really cool guests here today. Joining us today are some authors of the article Assessment of Social Validity and Function-Based Intervention Research Involving Students with IDD, a Prevalence Review. This is by Carpenter, Snodgrass, Walker, Pinczynski, and Harris, 2026. You can find it in the Journal of Positive Behavior Interventions. Our first guest is a research assistant professor in the College of Education at Clemson University. She's also the principal investigator of the Behavior Alliance of South Carolina Technical Assistance Project funded by the South Carolina Department of Education. Her scholarship focuses on supporting special educators and general educators to collaborate to design and implement supports, specifically positive behavioral supports for students with extensive support needs to promote access to and participation in general education classrooms. She's also interested in how we can include input from students with extensive support needs into the design and implementation of behavior support plans they receive. Dr. Megan Carpenter, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here and talk about one of our favorite topics.
Awesome. I can't wait. But let's not get too far ahead because we have one more person here. Joining her is assistant professor in special education at Boise State University and a board-certified behavior analyst. Her research focuses on autism, applied behavior analysis, and evidence-based practices for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities and extensive support needs in school settings. Her work examines communication, writing instruction, technology-based interventions, and community-based participation. Before entering academia, she was a special education teacher in Henderson, Nevada, which continues to inform her research and commitment to improving outcomes for students with disabilities. Monique Pinczynski, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us today. And I beat you guys. I think it's been in the hundreds all week. So
Oh man, yeah. So how are things in your necks of the woods? We're kind of like sandwiched in between. We got Midwest represented, we got Southeast Coast, and we've got kind of the western side of the country. How are things going out there?
Boise is lovely in the summer. We've done some river floating and some hiking, but it is hot. And we have wildfires, which is horrible. So,
No thanks, no thanks. Megan, how's South Carolina?
It's always hot here in the summer, and like summer is like April to October, November. But we can escape to the mountains and the coast all within like 3 hours. So we've got reprieve whenever we need it.
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
With Boise, is that the high desert up there? So at least it's a little less humid, maybe.
yes.
I know.
Yeah.
My aunt and uncle lived Chalice National Forest in that area, so the other side of the range, I think, from Boise. But I remember being up there, and it was warm, but seemed almost bearable because you didn't have the humidity pouring in on you.
Yeah. And in the mornings, it's still like, 70s. I grew up in Vegas and it's 100 degrees when you wake up in
Yeah.
the summer. So,
No thanks all around. But this is what I complained about during the winters. I wanted this type of weather. So here, I don't know. What can you do?
I know better.
Well, hey, we're not here to talk about the weather. We're here to talk about social validity, and specifically this paper and some of the ethical dilemmas and considerations that kind of arise from your findings. So I thought we'd kind of dive into your paper at first and kind of talk about what it is that you looked into and what those results were of those findings. And then maybe in the latter half of our episode, talk about some of the ethical considerations and dilemmas that might mean for the field as a whole.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, our task list and our ethics code should compel BCBAs to identify and prioritize socially significant, client-informed, and culturally responsive goals. You, as a team, looked into examining whether students with intellectual and developmental disabilities are actually being included in these social validity assessments. What kind of prompted you to start asking those questions and to look into this topic as a whole? And Megan, I can start with you on that one.
Yeah. So for me, it was actually my dissertation. So I was following very closely those single case guidelines for research because it was my dissertation. I wanted it done perfectly, and it wasn't, but that's what I wanted. I was looking at the social validity components, and I just wrote in social validity for students. And my advisor and other committee members said, well, how are you going to do it? I was like, well, we're using, they're like, go back to literature and look. And there wasn't a whole lot to go on. So I made some adapted questionnaire with picture supports and, things we do for reading comprehension for students with autism. And it was fine, but it was not great. But it kind of led me down the path of, okay, so what are people doing more broadly? What did I miss? Why aren't we getting this view when we have the ethical code? When it's supposed to be a person-centered plan for behavior intervention? It's about an individual person. Why don't we have that individual person's perspective? And then that coupled with what we hear about the, anti-ABA sentiment. Why did people have terrible experiences with ABA? Well, some report it being life-changing, while others report it being life-changing in a detrimental way. So those two things kind of coupled, we're like, well, what's going on here? What are people doing?
Yeah. All good questions. Monique, how about you?
Yeah. So I was interested in joining this team. I joined this team this project has been in the works for years. And I was actually a doc student. And that's how Megan and I met. We went through the same program. And we're all school-based researchers. And, I've heard about increasing conversations about social validity in the ABA world, but when I'm in schools, I don't really see it happening. And so that really prompted me to join this team and see what's happening with our researchers, even using it in school settings with students. And similar to Megan too, I think this is a powerful way to, stand up for our science if we have direct clients' feedback that what we're doing matters to them and is effective. I think that is really important and can help us moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve and I were just actually talking about this the other day, how PCP and person-centered planning, which you mentioned, Megan, is it's in the law in a lot of the states and jurisdictions and organizations and things like that. But it's actually, I was being a little more diplomatic by saying its actual implementation might vary, organization to organization, or the way that the laws are interpreted. And Steve was like, no, it's basically, people say they're doing it sometimes in practice, but yeah, but in actuality, it can look very much, overlook student opinion and input as well.
Yeah, and we're talking again more mental health side too, and we see some in the schools, but not as much. And that person-centered plan is led by a professional like 90% of the time, and then it's does that sound good to you? Okay, yep, they said that sounds good, and then move on. And it's ridiculous. But.
Yeah, similar to one of the issues I saw with the social validity of my dissertation. I was during COVID, so I wasn't there to actually do it. The teacher did it with the student. And I saw where like the teacher had erased the original circle to like prompt a more positive response that they liked the intervention, when like there was clearly a first circle that said, no, this was boring.
No. Oh man. Well, clearly some work to do then. So go ahead and I guess whoever wants to take the lead on this, walk us through what the purpose of this review was then in this paper, and some of the research questions that you asked going into this paper.
Yeah, so our original premise was to look at function-based interventions. Monique and I and Virginia Walker, one of our co-authors, really do a lot of work in behavior interventions, PBIS, for students with extensive support needs. So students who have the 1% of students in our schools taking the alternate assessment have the most pervasive ongoing support needs across a variety of domains. Sometimes those are intensive behavioral support needs. Sometimes they're not, but this student population is more likely to need kind of those individualized student behavior support plans. So we were originally looking to see what's being done around social validity in function-based interventions for students with extensive support needs. However, unfortunately, that sample was so small, we didn't have an article. So we kind of broadened it a little bit to be all students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and just first premise looking at the prevalence of social validity assessments among intervention studies for function-based interventions in U.S. pre-K-12 schools. What's the prevalence of students with IDD being involved in those social validity assessments? And then when they were involved, what types of data collection methods were employed to collect that social validity data from those students with IDD?
Gotcha. So are we doing the social validity assessments, 1, and 2, are they being involved in the actual questions? And thinking back to that Wolf, the 1978 paper of the goals, what is it? Goals, outcomes, and I'm missing
procedures.
That. You would know better than me. Procedures. Yes, there you go.
Yes.
So the actual students involved in those, and then how are those data being collected? Is it survey based? Is it this or that choice? Those types of questions. So. And then, so as far as your lit review goes, what were kind of your inclusion criteria as far as papers and, which studies would be included in your review? And then what kinds of interventions were you looking for?
Yeah, so we were specifically, again, looking at function-based interventions in school settings. And we looked at peer-reviewed articles and unpublished dissertations and theses from 2006 to 2022. And we chose that date range due to the Horner et al. 2005 standards that increased emphasis on social validity, as well as the reauthorization of IDEA in 2004. And our inclusion criteria were that they needed to use a single case research design, include a function-based intervention for at least one student with IDD, and then include data collected through an FBA that informed the FBI and was conducted in the United States. So that was what we were looking at there.
So we first looked at, so we had a colleague of ours, Melinda Snodgrass, who really helped us develop a definition of social validity that was broad. So hoping to capture anything that might be social validity related. So we weren't just looking at the social validity section of an article, but did they do anything that might be considered social validity? And
Okay.
so we found 142 reports of these function-based interventions for students with IDD in school settings. And of those, 57 included social validity from anyone. So it wasn't just like, so less than half even had social validity data. And we looked at, social validity, of course, like if there was a section, but then social importance, significance, appropriateness, feasibility. We did not include maintenance and generalization because those are separate categories in the single case guidelines. So we didn't include those, but we did kind of look broadly around terms that could be social validity, but also methods for social validity. So we looked at things like a comparative norm or focus groups that were used as a follow-up, interviews, surveys. We looked at a broad range of methodologies. So only 57 of the 142 used any kind of social validity from anyone. And then of those 57, only 11 collected any type of social validity data from students. So it was, of our total 142, 8% of studies attempted any type of social validity. And we didn't look at quality of social validity or how they used the data, just that they attempted any type of data collection around social validity from students in 11 cases.
I'm trying not to be very bummed out by that finding. Were you surprised by that, or what was your take on gathering those numbers and saying like, wow, this is very small?
I think we weren't completely. I think we were hopeful it would have been more, but we weren't surprised it was that low. We know this is an emerging area in our own research that we're trying to do better. So it wasn't completely a surprise, but the other reviews that have been done around social validity, around behavioral interventions, there's been some variability in how often student input was collected. Like there's a review in 24 by Huntington and colleagues around social validity and behavioral interventions. And they found that recipients who had IDD were the least likely to be asked any type of social validity questions or collect any social validity data from them. So we weren't surprised, but I think we were hopeful that we were wrong.
Yeah. Go ahead,
I think
Monique.
one thing too that, maybe I was surprised about is we had this really broad definition of social validity and it was still so low. So like overall, the results aren't surprising initially, but then when I look at how broadly we defined social validity, that is even more upsetting, I think, to see what could have counted. We also included assent as a possible aspect of social validity. So there was very little student input collected across these studies.
So you cast a pretty wide net there.
Yeah.
We did look at preference assessments too. We included them as a social validity measure if the authors anywhere in the article indicated exactly how they use that information from the preference assessment. And I think that surprised me a little bit more was we had, I'm forgetting the exact number right now, but
66.
We had 66 articles use preference assessments, but only one indicated how they use the data from the preference assessment to develop the FBI. So that I think that surprised me a little bit more, that it wasn't explicit in how we're using student input if we do collect it in another way.
I want to talk about some of like the potential implications of this too, but you also looked at the methods that researchers who did obtain social validity data, how they obtained that data. Do you want to talk about that? What some of the more commonly used social validity data techniques were, and then any strengths or limitations you noticed in those processes?
Yeah, for sure. So for studies that collected social validity data with anyone, so not looking at students, most often researchers used surveys or questionnaires, skills, and interviews, which isn't surprising. That's kind of the go-to when we're thinking about social validity. And we do think there are a lot of limitations with surveys and questionnaires being the kind of go-to method. And for a variety of reasons, who's delivering that survey or questionnaire, how are the questions written, and especially for our students with more complex communication needs, looking at, is that language accessible to them? What are their discrimination levels looking like when they complete that survey? So that being the prominent method is not the best finding either.
Sure.
And when we looked at the most often used methods with students, actually the concurrent chains procedure was used most often across our 11 studies that did include student social validity. And then after that was surveys and questionnaires, as well as normative comparison. Some other interesting student-facing social validity methods were one study had stakeholders review video clips of various conditions to rate the social validity of the intervention. And then another one tracked the decrease of the use of restraint and seclusion. So after the function-based intervention, did they see those practices decrease? So those were kind of the ones that fell in that other category if you were to look at our tables there.
Gotcha. Was there any indication of like communication modality of the students in these studies, like whether they communicate via vocal verbal communication, PECs, anything like that?
So in this review, we were just looking at prevalence, but we are working on another paper that is specifically looking at the communication modes of the students involved and what that looked like for these assessments.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well, we'll have to have you back for that one then.
To be continued.
With the questionnaires and rating scales and stuff, it seems to me that there may be a lot of behavior analysts, and of course, they're probably not necessarily the ones publishing, but who may not even know the alternative to that sort of thing when they're going into these situations. Would you do like a kind of forced choice between two interventions to see which the person chose if they're nonverbal, or maybe just take data on other behavior that signals that this is not a preferred method? How would you guys go about that?
Yeah, so I think that's where we're exploring right now. Because the literature doesn't give us a lot of guidance. The concurrent chains procedures that were outlined were really clear in one of the studies in particular that, did some programming with color coding to help students understand which intervention was taking place when. Students experienced both interventions, and then they had the students systematically choose. There was another one where they used a preference assessment with pictures and objects related to that intervention. So the student used the preference assessment to get which intervention the student wanted. I would say there was less, and this is informally, we're still working on that next level of data analysis, as Monique mentioned. So this is more informally, but there was less done to look at student social validity around the procedures and outcomes of the intervention. Or not procedure and outcomes, the goals and outcomes of the intervention rather than the procedures. I think we saw things that were not surveys looking more at the procedures, and things that were surveys kind of being a little bit more across all of those. So I think we don't really have things that we're doing. Like I'm doing some things on like behavioral indicators. Recently had a student who went to assess the student to participate in the study, and she shoved me and ran away. I was like, that's clear. That's clear. No. Like you don't want to be part of this. You don't want to be here. That was a clear indication that what I was presenting to her was not socially valid from her perspective. So I think we're still exploring what's a good alternative, a reliable alternative, meaningful for our students who communicate in other modalities.
That's a very good point. That would forced choice, those sort of things only work with the procedures themselves. What would you even do necessarily with the goals and outcomes? I'm thinking we work with people with a lot of severe behavior, and so usually they can tell us what their goals are. They may not like the procedures, but at least we can work on knowing that this is the goal we're working towards, especially if there's a court order involved. But if the person's nonverbal, we really are looking to the others in their environment and the caregivers to figure out what those things are. But we also have a little less time. We're not able to sit in there in sessions and try to figure it out. So that is interesting. I don't know if there is a good way that I can think of to test some of those things.
I think one of the issues too is that we're all navigating these kind of like power dynamics, but no one's really talking about it. Especially you're not seeing it in the literature of maybe dissenting opinions of social validity and how you came to a conclusion that you would implement something a different way. So that's something we're really interested in as a future direction, is like, how do we navigate these complex issues? Like, Stephen, you bring up a great example of like having a court ordered intervention, and there's a lot of contingencies that are at play. And it's not always as simple, but we really believe that we should at least be trying to gather that student input, focusing on student dignity and compassion.
Going along with that, I think a lot of the conversations our team had was, if we have a student who's engaging in behavior that is a physical danger to themselves or others, we're going to get their input, but they're not necessarily going to get the final say in if we're going to intervene in this behavior, right? They're causing harm to themselves or others. So when we talk about this idea of student input around social validity and social acceptability of interventions from a student perspective, it's really this wrestling with who's, in what situation does that kind of take precedent? Where is that like lead our discussion? And were there situations where we gather that and we make adjustments that we can, but in the certain circumstances, we can't make that a priority opinion because we have to keep a child or others safe.
Yeah. We had Dr. Morris on. It was our first episode talking about assent, and I think I mentioned this in a previous episode, but I asked him, like, what do you do in those scenarios where the client, the person who's at the center of the plan, is saying, no, I don't want to change this behavior, but the caregiver, who would be kind of that second ring in the social validity, discovery, is saying like, no, we need this changed. And I was hoping for like a good, like, I actually have a good like flow chart you can follow, and there's just not one.
I think we like to like hope there's like, this easy decision-making matrix, but it's not simple. It's really, I think, one of the more complex things that we have to wrestle with.
Well, I think that's with our team too. What we've talked about is like social validity isn't let's make it acceptable. We want to check this box that's acceptable for everybody. But social validity is a bigger conversation. How do we balance the needs of the community, the needs of the individual, the desires of the individual, and those in their community with the social validity piece and the effectiveness of an intervention, the evidence base. So it's really about having like a conversation around the intervention, making the most socially valid decisions we can make around effective intervention, while acknowledging that there might be factors and times, like small children don't always want to engage in direct instruction reading, but we have to teach them to read, right? There's the same occurs for our students with IDD around behavioral intervention. Sometimes we have to teach skills that they say they don't want to learn, but how can we adjust things to make it more socially acceptable, even if we can't change other things? Sure.
It might be impossible to assess, but do you, your review encompassed a literature review. Do you think your findings reflect or maybe don't reflect what's happening like on a broader scale, like in clinical practice or special education as a whole today?
So in my past life, I worked in a clinical setting for a bit, and it was somewhat recent. And compared to schools, I think it's happening more often in clinical settings. And I think that's due to the nature of like, there's BCBAs, they have access to research. In school settings, teachers aren't reading research. most of the schools that I work with, they don't have BCBAs. They might even not know what ABA is. So these ideas are very foreign to them. That's not to say that they're not doing maybe some things related to social validity, but having this like broad view and purpose, I think I am not seeing as often as clinical settings when I go into schools. And again, we were hopeful with our expansive definition that we would see it more. And if I were to take that expansive definition and then look at our environments, I would say, you know, I do think they're happening, or this is happening a bit more, but there's still a lot more work to be done.
Yeah, coming into this, I was going to ask, you know, how much of it is the actual intervention, or if anybody looked into the words being used, is it jargon based, and that maybe some things they don't like the idea of it versus, but it sounds like there's not even enough data to suggest what might be going on in some of those situations. I remember one time I did something that was like trying to describe someone, we're gonna do some discrimination training, and they're like, oh, you can't do that, you teach people to discriminate. I'm like, hold on a second, hold on, let's go back a minute.
Do you think that there is or I guess, why is there maybe a tendency for practitioners or people providing services, FBAs, function-based interventions, to rely more on caregiver and provider perspective than voices of the individual receiving services? Is this a thing that's just maybe just being overlooked? Is it something where it's like, oh, duh, we should have been doing this a long time ago? You know, like what are some of the barriers there?
I think sometimes from my experience in schools is it's just easier sometimes to ask the adults. We want to get a kid supports quickly. Maybe there's some big behaviors going on that are interfering with their learning and that of others, and we just want to get it done quickly. And it takes extra time to get that student perspective and consider it and build that collaborative team that's inclusive of the student. But this also coupled with low expectations historically for students with IDD and misconceptions about what they might be able to contribute. Thinking that, you know, they can't, if they don't communicate in a conventional vocal verbal manner, that maybe they can't communicate or they can't share with us their ideas and perspectives. And so we've also just had this tendency to rely on expert driven behavior intervention plans, which is important to have that expert with the technical, you know, make sure our plans are technically adequate, but they can't be the only person on the team, the only person driving intervention. If we think about contextual fit and student perspective and making sure that works within those settings. But I think it's just a lot of times our expectations of what we think students can contribute. Well, we can get all that information from their mom, or we can get that from their teacher. Their teacher's had it for 2 years, and we just don't take that time. But I think it's been, when we bring up this idea to other researchers, I say we receive very little pushback. Like, yeah, you're right. We should try. We should do better with this.
Sure.
When I bring it up in school settings, sometimes I get a little, nobody said no, but sometimes there's if you think you can get something out of him, or if you really think he's going to respond type of, nobody's saying we shouldn't. I think nobody's saying we shouldn't do it. There's just different levels of support that we encounter.
Sure.
Yeah. I think it's related to resources too in school settings. So also teachers are juggling a lot, and asking them to do one more thing is really off-putting sometimes. Even if it is something that could increase the social validity of their intervention, I think there's a lot of contingencies in the classroom. Like Megan said, they want a quick fix sometimes. And just, you know, they have 12 plus students in their classrooms that they're working with. So it's a lot more complex, I think, especially when we're thinking about like procedures like concurrent chains. Like, that'd be awesome to see that more in school settings. Like, looking back to when I was a teacher, I would need a lot more like hands on deck in the classroom to take care of the 9 students that I have at once. So like thinking about the future really needs to be more practical too for our teachers.
I think it's even more complex because some of our students with excessive support needs are in general education classrooms. So we have a special ed teacher who has maybe some behavioral knowledge, but then we have a gen ed teacher who likely has very little behavioral knowledge. And so we just add another level of complexity to the support that educators might need to not only develop and implement a plan that's technically adequate, but now socially valid as well. And that is a lot sometimes for our educators to juggle with very little support sometimes.
Yeah. Do you think it has anything at all to do with this idea of kind of that shift, I don't know, 50 some years ago, where it's kind of like treating people with special needs like they're eternally children? I get that a lot, especially with the adults, but also some kids in a classroom setting where even the guardians or like the direct caregivers from home are like, oh, they don't need to know that, they're never going to learn that. I'm like, well, we could really work on this in just a couple of days, but they're not able, or even if they are able to advocate for themselves, this general picture of why you're getting everybody's hopes up kind of thing, since that kind of pushes against that sometimes too.
Yeah, I think that's goes back to what Megan was saying, that like also lack of expectations. They just see that person and what they're able to do right now, and maybe for a lot of different reasons that's where they stop, and they don't even try after that. So
I was gonna say it. I had one situation that was really frustrating where I was in the IEP meeting. I said, all right, we're going to try a very, very basic picture exchange. We're not even going to do the PEC system. We'll just do some exchanging. And we've been doing this at home and it's working. But the speech path is like, oh, no, he'll never be able to learn that. I mean, but we're already doing it. And so the whole kind of consensus was, oh, well, if he's not going to learn it, then why are we bothering teaching communication? And just weren't going to do it at school at all anymore.
Yeah, it's wild. I was thinking back to our conversation with the Livingston lab, and this was man modality preference assessments, but part of their research was looking into agreement between, preferred communication methods between students and caregivers. And I think it was like, if it wasn't 0%, it was really close to 0% agreement. Like, oh yeah, they'll definitely use an iPad, but students were like, no, I want to do this. And so like, just thinking of using caregivers as proxies for student voice, as much as they know and as the experts that they are and teachers alike, there's probably a real element that we're missing by not including student voices in these assessments.
There's an older Waymeyer study in 2004 where they looked at what a student was able to identify in the FBA process that teachers and caregivers didn't pick up on. And they noted that, like with setting events especially, the students are the ones that identify those much more than an educator or a caregiver, because they're the only one that sees that argument with mom in the morning and then going into math class, right? Like they see that connection, but no one else actually observes that connection within their community.
Wow. That was Waymeyer, you said?
Yeah, 2004.
I'll look that one up and include that in the show notes. What are your thoughts then? I know it looks like you're looking into it for future research, but how behavior analysts can meaningfully assess social validity with individuals who might have limited or complex communication abilities. What are your recommendations for, the practicing BCBA now who's like, I would like to incorporate this more into my practice, and I'm not really sure how. It seems kind of difficult to do.
Yeah, so based on the findings of this paper, the most often used method for that population is that concurrent chains procedure. And other than that, there's not a lot out there right now. So, we have ideas, but again, this is still, I think, a really emerging area of research and practice. I think, Stephen, you were talking about using behavioral indicators earlier, I believe. And I think that is a great start, and something that is more practical, especially for educators, is to just look at, how is the student responding? Are they pulling away when I'm using this prompting method? Are they coming to the table willingly? And maybe is there a high rate of challenging behavior? If there is, what can I do to maybe change something and still have it meet a goal? But we don't have a ton of answers right now because this area is so limited. I wish, we had all the answers, but I think the most important thing right now is first to try, and for researchers especially, to start documenting what they do. A part of me hopes that maybe researchers are doing it more, but they're just not documenting it. If we looked at our expansive definition and maybe they did do some nice assent procedure because it's already in the IRB, but they didn't tell about it because it's just in the IRB. So they're not going to write it up in the paper. So I think, as far as researchers go too, there needs to be a more focus on actually reporting some more nuances of what's happening with this.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I can definitely see how if you're excited about like the results of your study, that may be an afterthought. But then others are reading like, yeah, but they even, was it causing other issues that we're not sure of? Is definitely important.
Yeah, and I think we are. I think later, or did it already come out, Megan? One of our papers is looking at when they collected the social validity, and most often it is on that outcome side, which is problematic also.
I think one thing we might be doing, but it's really unclear, was we mentioned there were like 60 some of the articles use preference assessments. We have no idea in all but one case how they're using those data. So I think, like Monique said, for researchers reporting for behavioral lesson practice, like how are you, maybe you're collecting some of the student perspective, but how are you meaningfully incorporating it into the plans that you are designing and implementing?
Gotcha. Yeah. What, kind of expanding that question, what ethical concerns in your views do you see arising when we make treatment decisions without directly evaluating the client's experience and input?
So I think one of the things we have to consider is that the student is not just an object receiving an intervention. So if we don't consider their voice within the plan, we're just treating them as a recipient of what I want to do or what their team wants to do, not necessarily supporting them in a successful long-term behavior change that's helping them meet their goals. So it's almost as if we're treating that student as like an object who's like, okay, yeah, we have this great plan because we think you're going to want all these skills. And then we talk to the student and realize that, yes, it was really important that I stopped hitting my peers in the lunchroom, but I really would have preferred if somebody, kept my textbook within reach and then taught me how to use it, didn't just throw it at the end of the table on a hook where I'm supposed to go get it. Right? So I think there's ways, we just got to really think about that this is a person who's going to have their individual goals that might differ from mom or dad or the teacher, like any other student without a disability. And if we don't attempt to get their input on anything that we're doing, we're not acknowledging that humanity that exists for every student, including those with IDD.
I think it all goes back to client dignity and the work that we do, and really we're there to make those socially significant changes and at the heart of the client and their goals and their needs. And yes, those other stakeholders matter. I have a personal example. My dad, we've been taking care of him the last couple months, my husband and I, and he has mental illness and he is doing well, but my husband is like, he needs to walk more, he needs to eat better, he needs to drink more water. And I'm like, babe, he doesn't want to do any of those things. He is happy watching Everybody Loves Raymond. And you know what? His lab results are fine. So he's eating his donuts and enjoying life, and he's getting some of his goals met, but he's so happy. And it was so funny because it was while we were writing this, and then this podcast came up, and I was like, this is such a personal example that I even grapple with, is going back to what's important to that person and navigating those issues. I might invite him on a walk, but I'm not going to force him to go on a walk.
Man, yeah, the scene is still fresh in my head. Being in a group home, I was called in to help an individual with severe SIB, and I'm sitting there while these one nurse and 2 staff members are sitting there eating fudgesicles in front of this guy who's just he's signing. And they say, no, he needs to lose weight. And I'm sitting there just like, does nobody see the irony in what's going on here? Like, and I point blank asked, like, do we eat popsicles in front of him every day? And like, well, it's our break time. Can we maybe practice that somewhere else? Like, or let him have a popsicle? Like what's the issue here? I don't quite understand. But yeah, sometimes go ahead, Steve.
So even globally, this idea that people should want to be productive or moving or doing something at all times. And I've had a few extreme, especially self-injury cases going in and like, let's just not place unnecessary demands for a while and see what happens. And things get way better. I'm like, oh, well, they didn't want to go for all the walk and do all the different activities like the state's mandating that they get the opportunity to do.
Yeah.
But they just want to chill out. So let's let them do that for a while.
Yeah.
I think you're bringing up a really important point too. Like sometimes our clients or students, they're expressing things and we're ignoring them. Right.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not always about intentionally asking, but acknowledging what they're already willing to share.
I like that. Yeah. For any BCBAs listening to us talking about this, any BCBAs who are like, hey, I'm going to pick up that paper and read it. What do you hope the greater behavior analytic community takes from what you found and what questions still remain, and then how that might influence or change their approach upon reading it?
I think for me, it's just that someone would read it and say, hey, I think I have this idea of a small step that I can take to ask a student, ask a client, and include something that they're sharing to adjust what I'm doing. So that my clinical practice, I know I'm just considering what they want and what I am trying to do, whether that's adjusting a goal slightly, whether that's, changing my prompting procedures. We've done some other work looking at social validity of evidence-based practices from autistic perspectives. And, the other thing is like, stop just going to hand over hand before asking us, right? Maybe next time I approach that student to use a hand over hand prompt, I ask, because I noticed that they don't like being touched. You're just I hope that somebody reads it and says, hey, we're not doing this, but I think I can make a small step to change, to work towards kind of centering that student perspective in my decisions. And I would hope that some people don't take away that we are saying that we always privilege the student's view in all of our decisions, because that our view is that they should be part of the team, not the ultimate decision maker.
Sure.
That has the final say in everything.
Sure.
You mean just wanting free access to every reinforcer is not part of the goal?
Right. And a lot of these are school-age children. So our 5, 6, and 7-year-olds, they don't get to make all decisions regardless of disability, behavior support need. That's just not how things work for small children. So we consider them, but sorry, you're still going to learn how to read. You're still going to learn how to make your bed, right? We're going to not hit the kid next to you. Like, those aren't choices, but there are choices and preferences we value.
Yeah. And like you said, there are aspects of even in maybe learning something that might be non-preferred that we can certainly change to fit client style and preference as well. Yeah. Monique, any follow-up on what you hope BCBAs might take from your work here?
I hope that BCBAs see that this is possible, even though it's a really limited amount that we're seeing right now in the literature. And this is, again, from the researcher side. But there is some evidence that you can do this in a variety of ways. And I really like what Megan said, just taking small steps. We know we're collecting a lot of data already. What data can we use to already say maybe that our intervention and our procedures are socially valid? Like one of our articles in the review looked at, again, declining rates of restraint and seclusion. Is that the best data for social validity? No, but it's something that you probably already have, right?
Sure.
So again, just thinking about where can you start, and maybe what are you already doing to make this a priority in your practice?
It just the way you said that, it made me think about how many people probably see escape maintain behavior and then immediately try to work on some break instead of seeing, is there another procedure that would teach the same thing and just be less aversive to them? And it might be much easier than addressing the target behavior that we might be seeing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
What questions, and you've alluded to some of this, some of the follow-ups that your labs are working on, but even other calls to other researchers or the behavior analytic community as a whole, what questions still remain about this topic that you're exploring and that you'd like to see other folks explore in their academia?
I'll go first.
Yeah.
I think for me, one of the most intriguing questions is navigating these different power dynamics. I think that's something that is really important to wrestle with and think about as academics, practitioners, teachers. I think we're all operating on different contingencies. And thinking about that even as different professionals. And again, I don't think there's ever going to be like, this is the way that we arrive that this intervention is socially valid, but having these like open conversations with different stakeholders and perspectives to start at least having this discussion and maybe building some guidelines, maybe not again for an end goal of this is what it needs to be, but these are some ways to navigate these differing perspectives.
Very cool. Megan?
Yeah, and I think kind of to go along with that, how do we, like Mike was saying, how do we decide who's, in what situations, whose voice needs to be privileged, and how do we honor, all of the people involved, and then how do we do this consistently and effectively? How do we make sure we're getting real, meaningful feedback? And then when we have these divergent opinions and thoughts and views, are we reporting how we handle that? Like, especially to our researchers? Like, are we sharing with other researchers how we handle that? Are we sharing our social validity results? As we've shown, you can publish without social validity. So when the social validity aren't good, are we addressing that? Are we talking about next steps? Or as Monique talked about in our further analysis, we've noticed a couple times there were some things that people pointed out, maybe that they would change. Like, so what's the, not only collecting the data, but what's the practitioner response? What's the researcher response? And what's the reasoning behind that? So we can kind of guide each other and help each other learn how to make these decisions, because I don't think we're there.
Yeah, as a clinician, I would be really interested in reading up on the latest literature, then also seeing a discussion point. By the way, he hated it. He hated this. I would be really interested in knowing that. Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, really cool. We're nearing the end of our time. We've been discussing assessment of social validity and function-based intervention research involving students with IDD with our guests Megan Carpenter and Monique Pinczynski. Thank you both for being here, and we hope to have you back soon with some follow-ups and some more questions that you're looking into in your research. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.